It's Kyle here. Today I'll be reviewing The Armor of Light by Ken Follett. This is his newest book in his series of books set in Kingsbridge. Of these Kingsbridge novels, probably the most famous is, I think for sure, Ken Follett's most famous book, and it's the first book in the series, The Pillars of the Earth. This is one of my favorite books of all time. Absolutely love it. So every time a new book comes out in this series, I definitely read it, if anything, because of how much I love Pillars of the Earth. And Ken Follett is definitely one of my favorite authors as well. He's a really super talented historical fiction author. And I think he does a great job of setting very interesting stories with really fascinating characters in historical settings and using these historical events to kind of help move the plot around, but at the same time keeping the main focus on the storyline. And so the characters are always fictional characters within these historical events. It's not like he's writing a book and like Napoleon is the main character, something like that, if that makes sense. The reason I bring up Napoleon is The Armor of Light is actually set kind of in the Napoleonic era. But this book takes place late 1700s into the early 1800s, and like all the books, as I said earlier, set in Kingsbridge, England, which is a fictional city in England that Ken Follett uses to explore these big historical epic stories. Really enjoyed this book a lot. I would say The Pillars of the Earth is definitely still my favorite, but the last book in the series, Collab Fire, was one of the first ones. It was okay, I just wasn't as into it. To me, this was a little bit of a return to form, and I really loved it. The only thing that held it back from me saying like it's a truly great book is I wasn't super happy with the ending of it, but other than that, I thought the book was really awesome. And this book is super big, so I'm not going to hold it up the entire time. But kind of give you a little bit of an idea of the themes that this book is dealing with, because I don't want to delve too much into the plot. But it's exploring several things that are going on in England this time and how it impacts these citizens of Kingsbridge. So first off, as I mentioned earlier, you have everything going on in Napoleon. So in the background of this entire book, at the very early stages, they're talking about like, oh, there's this revolution going on in France. How's this impacting England? Are we going to have a revolution? And then as everything with the revolution unfolds, and then Napoleon comes to power, then you basically have years and years of basically non-stop war on Europe, and how that impacts everybody in England, from the well-off, the clergy, to the poor factory workers, the poor farmers. Everybody is impacted by this stuff that's not actually taking place in England. It's taking place in the European mainland, but these individuals just living their everyday lives are having their lives completely upended because of what's going on with Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. So I think this book does a really fascinating job of looking how these big historical events like the Napoleonic Wars impact people that you typically don't really think of. Like, usually when you study these events, like I'm a big history nerd, so when you're studying these events like these famous leaders like Napoleon and Alexander the Great, you're kind of thinking about the battles and the casualty figures on each side and how that impacts the balance of power after the battle and who wins and who loses. And you forget, Napoleon might be fighting a battle in Italy, but how that happens impacts a small town in England, like a factory worker, how much money they're making because the war is disrupting trade and their salary's cut in half. So their family starts to starve. So they have to try to steal something, and then they're caught. And because there's a rise in crime, because of the uncertainty about the economy, the law is really cracking down on it. So they sentence this person to be hung as an example. Just one example of many that this book explores of how these big, huge events that are taking place in Europe that have nothing to do with this town in England, Kingsbridge, is impacting everybody in ways that they don't really necessarily realize it's impacting. I think Ken Follett does an amazing job of showing this in this book. I really like that aspect of it. This is also a huge period of change in England, in the entire world, in regard to technology. So when the book first starts, Kingsbridge has kind of always been like, throughout these books, kind of a center of the textile industry and stuff like that in England. Everything, the early books that would like sheep farming and dealing with the wool, and now like you're starting to get in the early parts of the book like early stages of industrialization, but at the end of the book it's really going out. There's constantly introducing these machines And these people that, these very skilled artisan workers are now basically finding out like, oh, the job I was doing, that I was the only person that could do it. Now you've invented a machine that can like do the same work that 10 of me could do. And there only needs to be one employee to supervise the machine. And these people are beginning to lose their jobs. They're having their hours impacted. And they really can only do this job. So once they lose their job, there's nothing they can fall back on. And so it's kind of exploring this period that with so much turmoil in England. It explores a little bit the Luddite movement, which if you're not familiar with that, was like this series of similar riots / rebellions in England where factory workers would go in and actually destroy the machinery that they thought was taking their jobs as a way to protest and try to stop this evolution of industry. The entire time I was reading this, I'm like, well, this is very appropriate with everything that's going on with AI now and people being very afraid of how that's going to impact people's jobs in a variety of fields in the future. We kind of think of like, oh, what do we have in relation to people that live, well over 200 years ago? How can my modern life really relate to somebody, a textile worker in the early 1800s in England? Well, yeah, they weren't dealing with AI, but they were dealing with machines that were impacting their way of life. And I think, we're still grappling with that type of stuff today. So again, another really cool part of the book. The book also explores a period of attempt to reform the way England works, everything from the Church of England and efforts to reform the church and various basically groups deciding to maybe break away or trying to stay in the church and reform it. But also the stages of trying to reform how democracy works in England. At this time, the Prime Minister basically has more authority than the King and stuff like that, but still very few people get to vote in this town of Kingsbridge where thousands and thousands of people live. Only a couple hundred people get to vote because they're the landowners and stuff like that. But you get to see the early stages. People are like, is this really fair? Maybe the factory workers, maybe we should get to vote who's in Parliament as well. Why don't we get a say in all this stuff? So I think this book does a really cool job of exploring all these various big historical moments of this one period of time and how it impacts these very interesting characters that Ken Follett creates. I think that's always a great strength of his. He really writes characters that you care about and you become invested in. Both the good guys, the characters you're rooting for. He also creates great villains that like every time they come on, like, oh, I hate this villain so much, I hope they lose. But at the same time, they're so interesting, you kind of enjoy reading about them. I will say, kind of related to the villain, probably the part of the story to me that kind of fell apart, the last 100 pages or so when Ken Follett's kind of wrapping up the storyline for the various characters, the ending felt a little bit rushed. There was a big few events that I felt like, you wanted the characters to really deal with and digest what had just happened. But instead, like, an event would happen and maybe he would time jump a year or so ahead and you wouldn't really get the characters react to this big historical event, this big event that happened in their lives. You don't really get much reaction to it. As an example, with the main villain, there's a big shocking event that happens at the end of the book that kind of really wraps up his storyline. And when it happens, my first thought was like, oh wow, I can't wait to read the reaction of these characters that he's been battling literally for the past 40 years on a variety of topics and events in Kingsbridge. I can't wait to read those characters' reactions to what just happened. But instead we get a time jump and it's just casually mentioned, like, oh yeah, do you remember when that happened? That really changed life, but now we're dealing with this. And I kind of felt like that cheated the ending a little bit, and you felt like you didn't get as big of a payoff as you wanted. And there was a couple other small little things with the ending, kind of like that, where he didn't really delve as much into these wrapping up the story beats as I thought he should have, where the rest of the book, and that's one thing Ken Follett is well known for, he writes really long books and he really explores how all these various events of a book impacts the characters, both these historical events, but just the fictional events he's created as well. And I felt like the end, he kind of abandoned that a little bit and kind of abbreviated a little bit. It felt like, even though this book is, I believe, about 750 pages, it felt like the ending could have used another 40, 50, 60 pages to really explore how the characters were impacted by the events of this book. But that's my one small critique of Armor of the Light. Overall, I really enjoyed it. I would say if you enjoyed Ken Follett's books, I would definitely recommend checking out Armor of the Light. If you've never read any of his, what I would recommend, I wouldn't recommend starting with this book. I would recommend starting with his best book, The Pillars of the Earth. Because I think if you'll read this book and if you don't like it, then Ken Follett's not for you. Because if you don't like Pillars of the Earth, I don't think you're really going to like any of those books. But if you read this book and you're like, whoa, I love it, then explore the rest of his works. So that's my review of The Armor of the Light. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comment section below, what is your favorite Ken Follett book? Is it The Pillars of the Earth or is it another one? If you enjoyed this review, please hit that like button. I really appreciate the support. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel. Every new subscriber means a lot to me, so I really appreciate you that does subscribe to the channel. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the review. I'll see you the next time, and happy reading.